Hi, welcome to the State of the Nation webinar. Very excited to be talking to Mr. Brian Pottinger. For those that don't know, Brian Pottinger was the editor of the Sunday Times in the glory days of the Sunday Times. Brian, welcome to the State of the Nation.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here, and thank you, Mike.
Now, let's just, before we get into the discussion around your book, tell me, when you were editing the Sunday Times, you had a mammoth readership at that point. Obviously, it was the pre-sort of glory days of the internet that we've got today. But how many copies were you guys distributing at that time?
Well, at that stage, we were selling about 520,000 copies a week, and our readership was about 3.2 million. But during high peak news value seasons, and that occurred particularly during the elections and the democratic transition, we'd sometimes go up to 620 or 630,000. In terms of scale, we were the biggest in the country, and I'm told the second biggest in Africa after Al Ahram. So it was a big newspaper. It had a lot of clout. It was great fun being part of it.
Yeah, obviously the landscape has changed somewhat, because obviously you no longer sort of get as many physical copies out there, but certainly news following has changed completely, hasn't it?
I think it's changed in two ways. I think, first of all, I think the technology's changed. Obviously, I mean, that's what you're referring to. There's so many other different channels of receiving information, and it's becoming so narrow casted that people are able to pick and choose where they want to go to read specifically what they're interested in. So that's one area. And then, of course, the demographics of South Africa has changed, the reading demographics. You've had many of what you would have called the traditional Sunday Times readers who have either passed on or left the country or done other things or just aren't reading. And then you have a new wave of new readers, which are coming from, of course, new middle classes, new reading communities who are now accessible, whereas they weren't before. So the whole thing is an incredibly interesting mix. But the net result, of course, is the decline in printed copies.
But then you decided to get out in the top of the market. And one of the things you did to get out in the top of the market was to sell your beautiful house to a poor, unsuspecting guy named Mike Sham. And for those that don't know, I bought Brian Pottinger's house. That's a true story. And in fact, I live there to this day, and only happened to bump into Brian when he came to see our next door neighbor. So it's really, we circled back after 20 odd years, but we are trying to look after the place, Brian. So it's still there whenever you.
I've seen that, and it looks great.
So now, Brian, you then moved on from that, spent some time out of the country, but all along writing has been a passion. You wrote a few books. I know that I did I did read, I bought and read. You see, I've been a good follower of yours. I bought your book around Thabo and Mbeki. His kind of interesting legacy that he left in the country. You wrote the book, wrapping up or sort of putting Thabo and Mbeki in a bit of context. What was that like to write? Did you get access to him?
Well, I'd had access to him on a continuous basis as an editor. It's the type of thing you do. You meet that level of political leadership on a regular basis. I'd actually known him before when he was still in exile in Lusaka, because I'd met many of the ANC people well before they were unbanned as the nature of a journalist. I met them in London and in Lusaka and elsewhere. And so we knew each other, and I'm not pretending for a second we were close friends and that we nipped out to the pub every now and then for a beer. Wasn't that, but we knew each other. I think we kind of respected each other in terms of the roles that we had, but we were critical. Obviously, we were critical. I was critical of some of the positions he took and some of the processes he set in train, which had catastrophic impacts later for South Africa. He was critical of me because he regarded me as basically too judgmental, old style, and he felt, and maybe like justifiably, it's very hard to divorce yourself from your own background, your own experiences, your own worldviews. It's an old debate that goes on about a thing called objectivity. But anyway, we got on, and when I left journalism to go into media management and run media businesses across Africa, I kind of wanted to put a line under my political journalism career, and I wrote the book in which I tried to set out what I thought were the strong points of Mbeki, and he had many, and what were the weak points. And that was the book, TheMbeki Legacy, which I'm delighted to see is still quoted fairly regularly. I sort of feel moved to the core when somebody pops up and says, and as Brian Pottinger said in 94 or 6 or whatever it was. Anyway, that's it.
But of course, I mean, I know we're going to get on to your latest book in a minute, but much of what we live with in South Africa is a legacy of Thabo Mbeki. He was a strange guy in that he did a lot of things right, but my God, he planted some seeds, didn't he?
Yeah. I mean, he held himself out to be the great technocrat. He was the guy who was going to get things organized and modern, sophisticated, slickly running things. He tried very hard. And he did a great deal, which I don't think he's often given credit for. Certainly, I think the way he was thrown out of the ANC was disgraceful. He did promise to bring a number of infrastructural benefits to South Africans and to poor South Africans, and he did. He bought roads and clinics and schools and all sorts of things, electricity and water. He did that. The problem that I always had, and I referred to it in the book, is that while he was focusing on these technocratical physical infrastructure, the human infrastructure was weakening. He was not strengthening the nature of what you do in schools, which is educate, what you do in hospitals, which is heal, what you do with your police force, which is stop crime, and so on and so on and so on. And part of the reason that happened is because he was the prime architect and driver of Black economic empowerment and cadre deployment. And we know those two things have become the key enablers, not to just state capture, which accounts for a very small part of the money we've lost, but accounts for the systemic erosion of capacity of our national institutions. Now we pay the price after 8 devastating years under Zuma and 4 indecisive years under Ramaphosa. We're paying a heavy price now.
Yeah, in my opinion, never in the history of the world has the sort of term short man syndrome been more apt to a person than Thabo Mbeki. Didn't seem like there wasn't a situation that he couldn't misconstrue as a personal slight. Seems to be a strange guy.
He came very much with that background, and you know, we can make all sorts of explanations for it. The background, the history, from where he comes from, a struggle organization, seeking to translate itself into a democratic movement. But he was a very, very suspicious person. And he was particularly suspicious of big capital of Western countries. If you want to encapsulate it, he was a kind of almost prime example of what happens when you get a lefty UK university turning out a product from a developing world. That was him.
Yeah.
Everything was couched in terms of those kind of left-wing and socialist perspectives. Not that he himself was a socialist. In fact, he was all of the leaders. He was probably the most attuned to the demands of creating a successful modern economy.
Yeah, he just wanted socialism for the rest of us. He was fine with what he had. Yeah. So Brian, then we moved on, and life got a whole lot more interesting. And you recently written a book called States of Panic, right? And it deals with COVID, and you've got then quite a dramatic title, COVID-19 and the New Medieval. It was being quite dramatic, Brian. Explain to us why you were so dramatic, just even in the title.
Because I think we've just gone through a most extraordinarily dramatic moment in the history of the world, and particularly the developed world. You know, I always have to put the qualifiers up front. We did have a very serious viral outbreak called SARS-CoV-2. It did claim lives, and it claimed millions of lives. It did take away particularly the elderly and the very ill. We know all of that, and anybody who denies that and claims it's a grand conspiratorial fabrication is just not telling the truth. We know it was serious. But, and here's the big but, we've been through that type of stuff before. We've been through great decadal coronavirus outbreaks in 57 and 68. We've done it. And we have never had to do such extraordinarily destructive actions in order to contain it. To effectively control, to close the world down for the first time since the Black Death outside World War is an extraordinary thing to do. To lock people in their homes for weeks, to destroy businesses, to divide your society into those who got vaccinated and those who didn't. In other words, a health apartheid. To arrogate to yourself the most extraordinary dictatorial powers possible. Unthinkable 3 or 4 years ago in a liberal democracy. To do all of that and to say we did this because we had to do this for a disease, that whole narrative is now unfolding. It's unbundling. It is falling on its face. And there's now so much evidence, which I've contained in the book and which I've written about subsequently, which proves that this grand narrative was fatally flawed. And my point is that when you look at what drove this, let's take out the agents of interest, the people who had money to be made here. And again, I'll make the point, I don't believe they were in conspiracies. They were separate players doing what players do when there's a crisis, making bucks. Underlying that all was a great global psychology of fear, which in a longer sense, I believe, has been built up over the last 30 years by organizations whose job it is to create fear. So you had the confluence of a perfect storm of two factors. A virus, which was serious, players who now saw great opportunities for making advantages, and a public which lives with and has a permanent psychosis of fear. Boom. You've got COVID-19. And I believe that's medieval. I don't believe sensible, intelligent, modern people should respond that way to a crisis. I don't think they needed to, and I think we made a huge error by doing so. It was medieval in the sense that it was driven by fear and emotion and superstition, and by these very, very powerful, unaccountable sorcerers, medicine men, who we now call the scientific, academic, epidemiological community.
But Brian, those sorcerers that you call them, which I think is quite apt, they've sort of found a ready market for the fear peddling that they did, and obviously within the media groups, this was given complete airplay. So it didn't matter how wacky I mean, I'm always concerned when you give absolute power to anybody, they will use it absolutely. We know that throughout history. Here, absolute power was given to the scientific community. And it was largely given by the media. And in a way, if one rolls the clock back a little to people, regardless of our views of them, people like Trump, like Boris Johnson, initially they weren't biting, but it was the media that seemed to drive it through.
I think when the history of this period is eventually written, when this new medieval moment is explored by historians in the far future, one of the greatest culprits that'll come out of this is the mass media. I mean, speaking as an ex-journalist, I've been appalled by the quality of the reportage of this thing. In fact, what precipitated me to write the book was, in fact, a sense of great disappointment and even anger. How could people be propagating such rubbish? And that's what, I mean, I had no interest in virology or epidemiology. I was no interest in anti-vaxxers. I always thought they were a bit wacky guys. I was not interested in this issue at all. And yet the more I got drawn into it, the more I started saying, wow, what's going on here? And I'll give you an example, a simple example, Mike, is that I went through 800 pages of the guidance that was issued by the public health authorities like the World Health Organization, Centers for Disease Control, National Institute for Disease Control here, Public Health England. Yeah, I mean, 800 pages of this guidances that were sent out over a period of something like 12 months. What to do about diagnosing, reporting, and recording COVID-19. And Mike, an undergraduate journalism student could have gone through that stuff and come up and said, this is a con. No rocket scientists. It's a con. When you start saying, we used to have a system where there was a disease, we would test it laboratorily for blood, we would then come to a finding, and that would be recorded as a confirmed case. We went to a system which said, if you're a doctor and you think the guy may have COVID-19, and the definitions is He's got a bit of a sore chest. He may be coughing a little bit, and maybe he's feeling a bit depressed. He's a COVID-19 case, and he's instantly recorded as a COVID-19 case. All suspected COVID-19 cases were considered confirmed. And so even the World Health Organization dashboard, which refers to confirmed cases as being those that have been laboratory tested, were not laboratory tested. And I noticed when I engaged the World Health Organization on it, after a few months, suddenly there was a whole lot of qualifications to what confirmed actually meant. If you go onto their dashboard website now and you click info, here is this epic disclaimer about their own numbers. Oh, we're doing the best we can, guys, but basically our numbers are provided by other guys who we're not accountable for. So the very numbers of the organization, the very numbers of this pandemic are suspect. And this is not something new. I wrote my first article, published the first article in, God bless it, the Sunday Times, in May of 2020, saying the numbers don't stack up. Now, across the world, what's happening? Those numbers are being revised down, repudiated, qualified, everywhere. Britain officially admits 23% of the guys that they said had COVID-19 in their hospitals didn't die from COVID-19. Now, when you're looking at that level of kind of con, you feel you've got to do something about it. And even if you are a 70 retired beach bum, you do something about it. And that's why I got out and I wrote that book. And I had a tremendous battle to publish it. That was, again, one of the most disillusioning exercises that I've been through. Publishers I've worked with who've published, I've published 8 books, people I've known for years, friends. No, Brian, it's a bit dodge, it's a bit tough, this one. Let's wait 5 years and see. I go to get it put onto Kindle, and I'm instantly banned. I'm told I'm breaching their protocols. I go through 3 appeal processes, saying the book, every single statement is based by reference to a fact. It's all in the common. It's not anti-facts. It doesn't call on people to break the law. It simply raises questions about how we've actually reported this thing. 3 appeals, and they finally say, "Oh, okay, now we'll carry you." That's why that book is available. That is the book these kind of elements didn't want you to read, but it's there now.
And Brian, what role did China play in this whole thing? Because even recently we see another shutting down of Shanghai. We've seen, China putting out those visuals of them welding people into their homes and people dead in the streets, which all looks pretty fake now. But surely they had a role to play in all of this. And why? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, no, Mark, you get into, one can get into deep conspiracy theory on this. It was interesting. I was doing a podcast with an English language Indian publication, a very big one. And the first question I was asked is, do you agree that China created this virus to kill India? Now, that's a hell of a way to begin a debate. And I'm saying, well, I've got no evidence they did that, but all I'm saying is the way we've reacted to it and tried to cover everything up and repress every discussion about it just makes it possible or more possible for people to believe it. And that's what's happened. Of course, the repression of information has just led to the surge of all the conspiracy theories. But to your point, originally when all this came out, there were some people who thought that it might have been escaped from a virological research facility, which was in Wuhan, and there was one, a very big one, but it was categorized with the highest level of safety. So, a lot of people said no. There were then people who came and not only said no, their position that the Chinese may have accidentally or intentionally created the virus is not only wrong, but you're not allowed to say it. That's where we began the repression of information in this whole process. I personally have no idea. I don't know one way or the other. The subject's still open. We're not entirely sure to what extent can you manipulate spike proteins and so on. We just don't. I certainly don't know, and I don't have a position. The only thing I will say, and here, Mark, forgive me if I go the conspiracy bit for a second, I do know the potential and possible damage that authoritarian and autocratic governments can do when they have something like COVID-19 in their grasp. I find it remarkable that there's sudden resurgence of COVID-19 in China, where? In Hong Kong, which is the heart of the pro-democracy movement and essentially a secessionist state. You lock them up. In Sichuan, which is the major supply conduit to the West for Chinese products, they almost closed down. Shanghai, which is the high-tech center of China, is now locking up. Hey, and let's just throw in the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, who are always very cheeky people. Let's lock them up as well. Those 4 areas, fortuitously, are all suffering from this dreadful COVID-19. And precisely at the time, China is now in a rather contentious relationship with an ally at war with the West. You can make whatever you like of it. I use it as an example. If you start entrenching, as our government is doing, and I hope we'll come on to that in a minute, if you start entrenching autocratic and dictatorial powers around a misrepresented virus, you are creating the long-term prospects for the destruction of human freedom through false means. And I gravely fear that's what's happening in South Africa at the moment when I look at the latest regulations.
Now, Brian, we're going to get on to South Africa in a minute, but first let's just delve into the winners and losers out of this. You know, there are some dramatic winners that may not have set out that way, that may not have been the intention in the response, but I certainly have, you know, my own real problems with the response, being the fact that without question, the really massive winners, you know, setting the politicians aside, is big businesses, big established corporations. You know, when they closed down every business, they kept Pick and Pay open. When they closed down the mom and pop shop, they kept McDonald's open, or you could deliver through Uber or those kind of things. So big corporations, the people that supplied us our tech, the Netflix of the world, these corporations, the banks, have absolutely thrived and multiplied through this response to the pandemic. Am I correct, or am I reading it wrong?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that this pandemic, what it has done, whether intentionally or not, but what it's effectively done is created a category of great winners and a category of great losers. And if you wanted me to put them all in there, I mean, I would start with the public health entities like World Health Organization. It was fundamentally bankrupt. The sponsorship was retreating. People were pulling out their support. The United States was about to boycott it. Suddenly comes along COVID-19. In 1 year, their budgets quadruple. Boy, you know, right. Hospitals are desperately looking for budgets. Whoa, look at this. Budgets treble. The research organizations, we know that biomedical research organizations live on crisis. They have to. Nobody's going to pay them fortunes to research something that, you know, has no threat to us. They benefited. Then we start getting into the big players. We know high tech benefited enormously. This was a huge leap forward in their project of keeping us all locked in house as private, small, isolated individuals living for our entertainment, our commerce, our dating on them. And we know exactly what high-tech stocks have done during this pandemic. They've soared. And then, of course, the big guys who really made it, the pharmaceutical industries. And I don't need to go through that. Pfizer made $154 billion out of this vaccine, which is now being forcibly imposed upon South Africans. You know, you don't have to go very far about this. And I think the fact is that regulatory measures weigh much less on big corporations than they do on smaller ones. You know, you had a business, your own business. You know the pain that COVID-19 caused. When I'd finished all my career as a journalist, I bought a little restaurant in the UK, and I saw for the first time the impact of regulatory environments on small businesses, as you can imagine in the restaurant business and the food businesses. I paid them because I had to. But boy, if they were increased any further, I would go down and the big guys would be laughing. And that's the story. It was just compounded massively by COVID-19. The big guys were laughing at it. The small guys, 35%, I think I'm right, small businesses in South Africa wiped out.
Yeah.
So yeah, and so the victims are the small guys, and the ordinary citizens, and particularly the poor ones. And that, to me, is one of the gravest injustices of the way this pandemic's been measured in this country. The use of completely irrelevant Western ideas, data, profiles, demographics, imposed willy-nilly, me too, one size fits all by our advisors on our own country. The poor pay.
And as we said when we were having a chat the other day, it has been the ultimate middle class indulgence, hasn't it? To tell everybody, you stay home, I've got enough money, or I've got my job still, or whatever, but you can stay at home and we'll sort this out sometime. If you don't make it, sorry, but at least you're alive. That's kind of how it was sold, isn't it?
This COVID-19 has, more than anything else, set back by a generation any pretense at some egalitarian formulation to create a more equal society. We know from the stats, we know that income inequality has soared because of the results of this. We know unemployment among poor countries has soared. We know that starvation was a direct consequence. I don't even want to think about what the Ukrainian war is going to do now with the disruption of food supplies around the world. So COVID-19, in a sense, almost set us up for this greater tragedy of Ukraine. But the question one continually asks, who made those decisions? Who is advising the people who made those decisions? What was their interest and their benefit in this? That's the only question you ask. As a trained journalist, the first question you ask is, who benefits? Follow the money.
And in South Africa, that was fairly easy to do. We followed the money, and it surprisingly went straight back to the government and their backers, or their sycophants, right? Who, after our president promised us that there would be no malfeasance with the COVID-19 budgets, it didn't take long, did it? And the money was largely stolen.
Yeah, that's at the institutional level. It wasn't just a viral pandemic, it was a pandemic of corruption, as we know. And that's the one level of visible corruption, which we can all see as day after day more of these gangsters get bust, you know. But the less visible one, and the one that I'm most interested in now, given these new regulations or draft regulations, and what they've done in terms of workplace mandates, which is shocking, utterly shocking. I'm working on an article about it now, and very few people know about it. The attempt to force these vaccine mandates raises an issue of a wider kind of corruption. Why are we doing this? Now, you know, the background that I come from and the questions that I ask, I make no specific accusations or allegations. I simply say they must be investigated by a commission of inquiry. We know that developing world countries are always historically the dumping ground for obsolete, surplus, and pointless vaccines. We know that. And we know the pharmaceutical industry is not blameless in terms of ethics. Why are we so determined to push and sell vaccines? That's the linkage we need to examine and explore and understand how it happens. The other linkage we need to understand is the oldest one in the world. These pharmaceutical companies pay research guys to research cures to diseases. Those advisors then become advisors to government, who then pass the laws forcing people to buy the cures. It's a circle. Press repeat, you start again. Repeat, start again. That's what's happening here. We need to understand that. Who advised the government? Or did nobody advise the government? Did the government just do it? And why? We know there are a lot of investments going into new so-called vaccine factories in South Africa. I'm very happy about that. They're being suggested these are ways that Africa can liberate itself from the tyranny and imperialism of the old big pharmaceutical company. But what are the trade-offs that are made between the government who says, come and invest your vaccine factory here, and the markets into which you're operating? We don't understand any of that. It's all secret. And that's what we need to break open, and we need to understand. I'll give you one example, Mike, which is really the one that shocks me, and not many people know about it. We're focusing on the regulations that have been published for draft. which now deal with what's going to happen when you come from abroad, and they can push a needle in your arm and they can lock you up and they can do what they want with you, and you can't go to church and you can't go to this and you can't go there unless you get a vaccination certificate. In fact, all the public mass meetings that we as humans go to, sports events, church, entertainment, and grand celebrations, we now have to have vaccination certificates for. But the worst is that they have actually reached into an obscure part of our health and safety regimes, our occupational, industrial and occupational safety laws. They found the section there which refers to how you treat group 3 hazardous biochemical agents. Now, this is a very specific clause which is used to deal with businesses that make, store, handle, and transport biohazard materials and agents, things that are used in manufacturing processes. Nothing to do with coronaviruses, nothing to do with disease. They've actually invoked that section to empower employers now to force their employees to be vaccinated. Is that honest? Is that honest? Do you reach into a completely irrelevant piece of legislation and use that to force people to be vaccinated no matter where they were? And you're doing this particularly in the midst of a dying virus and the end of an engineered and guided panic. What's going on? What is going on?
Now, Brian, if we just sort of cast forward, obviously the behavior has been shocking, and we've out, and I think we all agree that it's just been bizarre and damaging. But how does this play out? Because to a degree, it looks to me like some of the really harsh ideas are being rebuffed quite quickly. So things like the mandatory vaccinations, I think if I'm not mistaken, Austria that started this, where they said everybody has to be vaccinated, and that didn't last, and it sort of receded a little. In the UK, we're seeing almost an opening up, and the vaccine passport sort of going the way of South African law, where it might be on the books, but nobody's really following up on it. Where do you think this thing plays out? How do you think that plays out?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting thing. And I think we're now at a crucial moment of that engagement. I mean, I've always said there are three things here. One is the virus itself, the epidemiology of the virus. That's almost now of historic importance. SARS-CoV-2 was a 2-year coronavirus, did this, did that, went up, went down, changed its nature, got other people and infected other people, but now it's just receding. The pathogenic intensity is retreating. That's the one. The second thing is, how do we understand what's going on? We know this. We cannot rely on science or the mainstream media to tell us, only the courts. So my view is that basically the whole story is now going to move into the courts. Finally, we're going to get to the truth, and that's why I'm saying, take this stuff to court. Let's have a judicial commission of inquiry. Let's find out what's going on. That's the only way we're going to get truth, because everybody else is lying. So that's the second thing. The third element is going to be the retribution side. Now, I don't want to kind of speculate too widely on this, but let me just give you one example, and all South African employers here should be sitting up and listening very carefully to this. In the United States, as you know, the United States Supreme Court has ruled that the attempt by the equivalent of our occupational safety bureaucracy and its administrative law cannot be used to enforce vaccinations. The Supreme Court's view was that a vaccination is something of such material impact upon the human rights of an individual. Such a thing can only be legislated by Congress itself. It's that big, not some inferior little administrative court using administrative law. That's what the rules be. So now you cannot, an employer cannot enforce this in terms of the regulations that they've been using. Everything's on hold. But here's more important. Now, of course, we are facing the most humongous civil law claims in American history against employers and government agencies, because forced vaccinations were and are unlawful and unconstitutional. Now, right now, we're getting forced in vaccinations through an obscure clause of our Occupational Safety Act, supported by employers and the employer organizations. I have no doubt when it gets to the Constitutional Court, which it most certainly will, There's already a movement to get 1 million signatures. By the time it gets to the Constitutional Court, it will be overruled. And then the lawyers' turn to make a lot of money. Everybody else has had their turn. Hell, why not the lawyers? So, that's, if you ask me where I think it's going to go forward, it's going to go forward into a massive day of reckoning, in which all the parties and the players correctly must now be held to account. As journalists, we were held to account in terms of the media ombudsman and defamation law, and primarily by the views of our readers. Engineer puts up a bridge that falls down, he's in trouble. A doctor does something tremendously wrong, he's going to be whacked. But an academic epidemiological scientist can come and destroy the world. And who's to hold that person accountable?
Right,
Who holds that person accountable? He gets promoted. He gets promoted. So I'm saying there will come a day of reckoning. There has to. And I don't say I welcome it. I just think it's just so sad. We've wasted so much time, destroyed so much value, created such tensions in our society, when we are moving into what I believe is final phase stuff. The big story, which is, of course, the fundamental fight between financial institutions of the West and financial institutions of the East, vying for control of global financial power. That's what the Ukrainian war is all about. Now, we've been so distracted by COVID-19, we weakened ourselves. We're not ready. Anyway, that's my theory.
Now, Brian, let's just wrap up with just a little bit of crystal ball here. Because you mentioned the Ukraine-Russia situation, where definitely COVID and its response played a role. Undoubtedly, it changed the balance of the world. Do you agree with that?
Yes. Yeah. I think that I don't want to go into a long history here, but I think 4 things have fundamentally changed the nature of our world. One was 9/11, which showed the limitation of military power when you're fighting asymmetrical forces. The great financial crisis, which showed the limitations of continuing generating wealth that is not supported by wealth generation. And that's really affecting currencies, particularly in the European Union. Thirdly, we had COVID-19, which now raises huge questions about institutions and has further weakened the economic power of countries. And then finally, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which now precipitates the big boy conflict between Western and Eastern economic force. If you go through all of those, they're more equally matched than we're often given reason to believe.
And just about each of those steps is quite a hefty blow to American hegemony. Almost every single one of those were lined up to bring America from its role of, as they put it in the end of the 90s, when they said it's no longer a superpower, it's a super duper power, and there's only one of them. And already the impact of Russia, Ukraine, and the problems that that's brought out is that the dollar may lose its status as reserve currency. If that happens, the petrodollar gone, that could be quite catastrophic for the US, but is it good for the rest of the world?
It's a long shot. If you want to kind of take the grand and romantic view, you're saying, okay, we're looking at the end of the 600 years of Western empire, and we're looking at the end of the American century. Okay. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? If you think of the alternatives, which would be Russia and China, I'm not sure that's a good thing. I would rather hope that you can kind of find a reassertment of value and strength and belief in Western countries and economic wealth and strength to support it, balanced against those interests of the East. I think that what has happened, at least I pray has happened, is that the developed world has woken up to the fact it can't just wander around the world meddling in other people's affairs, sending soldiers to do stuff, destroying regimes without the faintest idea of the consequences. You can't have an Arab Spring and get rid of all those Arab leaders because you don't like them. And then you suddenly have a resurgence of an 800-year religious war between 2 factions within Islam. and the emergence out of that of the most terrifying religious warriors we've seen since the Middle Ages. You can't just do this stuff and then walk away from it, and that's what the West has done. It believes its wealth can carry it. It can't. It believes it's always right. It's not. It believes that liberal democratic values can be applied everywhere and anywhere. It hasn't and can't be, and so on. So I hope this is the great reawakening. I hope we start getting tougher and more focused and more understanding of the core things which drive countries' value and make them successful. And now I'm going to show what a grumpy old man I am. Those core values: discipline, patriotism, faith, family, self-reliability, self-accountability, all of that stuff that made great nations throughout history. Unless you get back to that, hey, yeah, then we have lost. Then the empire is lost.
Well, Brian, it's been as interesting as I hope it would be. For those that are joining us today, please, please, please go and get a copy of Brian Pottinger's book, States of Panic, COVID-19 and the New Medieval. It's available. We'll put up a link right here on this webinar, and you can just click through and buy that book. Brian, thank you for being so generous with your time. We're going to do this again. We're going to be talking about some more interesting things. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us at the State of the Nation today, and we look forward to bringing you another guest that's maybe half as interesting as Brian Pottinger. But Brian, thank you so much for today, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thanks for the invitation. Great fun.